Today I want to share with you how to make an all-purpose spelt pie crust. And I'm going to share with you the specific adjustments that you need to make with fats and liquids so that your pie crust comes out perfect, flaky, and tasty every time. Hi, sweet friends. If we're meeting for the first time, I'm Mary from marysnest.com and author of the Modern Pioneer Cookbook, and I'd like to welcome you to my kitchen. If at any time in this video you want to jump ahead, I'll have detailed timestamps in the description below, as well as a link to the printable recipe. If you're new to baking with spelt, spelt is what's called an ancient grain. There are a variety of ancient grains. But what we're talking about specifically when we talk about spelt is an ancient wheat. Other ancient wheats include einkorn and emmer, with einkorn being the oldest. Now, the reason we're going to make this pie crust with spelt flour is because of the three ancient grains, the three ancient wheats, einkorn, emmer, and spelt. Spelt is the easiest to work with. So if you're new to baking with the ancient wheats, starting with spelt is a good place to start. And to make things even easier, we're going to make this pie crust with all-purpose spelt flour as opposed to whole grain spelt flour. All-purpose spelt flour has the bran and the germ removed from it, so it's a lighter flour. Its preparation is similar to the way modern-day all-purpose flour is made. You have modern-day wheat, modern-day whole wheat, that has the bran and the germ sifted out of it, and then you have what we call all-purpose flour, a lighter flour. And all-purpose flours of any variety, whether they're ancient wheat all-purpose flours or modern-day all-purpose flours, make a lighter baked good. And when it comes to making pie crusts, all-purpose flour works very well at creating a light, flaky pie crust. So that's why we're going to use all-purpose flour. But we're going to use spelt all-purpose flour because it is a little more nutritious than its modern-day counterpart, all-purpose flour, that's made from modern-day whole wheat. But baking with the ancient wheats, einkorn, emmer, or spelt, does require some adjustments to the amount of liquid that you use in your baked good, as well as the amount of fat that you use in your baked good. And it doesn't matter whether you're using the all-purpose version of one of these ancient wheats or the whole grain version of one of these ancient wheats. The adjustments do vary slightly because if you are using the all-purpose version of one of these ancient wheats, there are specific adjustments in terms of the liquid and the fat. And if you're using the whole grain version of these ancient wheats, there are also adjustments of liquid and fats, but they're different. And then, now I don't want to confuse you, but whether you're using einkorn, emmer, or spelt, individually have their own adjustments to liquid and fats. For example, we're going to use all-purpose spelt flour to make this pie crust. So we're going to pull the butter back a little bit, and we're going to pull the ice water back a little bit from what you would use in making a traditional butter pie crust. If you were using all-purpose emmer flour, you'd have to pull it back even a little more in terms of the liquid and the fat. And if you were using all-purpose einkorn flour, you'd have to pull it back even more than that. So spelt requires the least adjustment. So going back to what I said in the beginning of this video, that's why we're going to start with spelt flour. In future videos, I'll show you how to make einkorn and emmer pie crusts, but spelt is the most forgiving and requires the least adjustments. So this is a great place to start. Now we're going to make a single crust. So all we're going to need is 1 1/3 cups of all-purpose spelt flour. Now you don't have to weigh anything. All you want to do is dip your measuring cup into your flour and then just use a knife to level it off. It's often referred to as the dip and sweep method. You'll want to have a plastic bag handy And all you're going to do now is dump your flour right into your bag. And now we're just going to do the same thing with our 1/3 of a cup. Dip and sweep and into our plastic bag. Then to our flour, we're going to add a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And I'm just using a fine ground sea salt. And next we're going to add just 1/8 of a teaspoon of baking powder. This is going to really help. It's going to go a long way to making the all-purpose spelt flour act a little like pastry flour. Now I'm just going to press as much air out of this bag as I can, and I'm going to go ahead and pop our flour mixture into the freezer for 30 minutes. Now, if we were making this particular pie crust with modern day all-purpose flour, we would be using 8 tablespoons of butter. However, when you bake with all-purpose spelt flour, you have to pull the butter back a bit. So we'll need 6 tablespoons of butter and 2 teaspoons of butter. The next thing you want to do is just kind of eyeball the butter so that you have about 2/3 of it on one plate and about 1/3 of it on the other plate. The plate that has more butter on it is going to go into the refrigerator for 30 minutes. The plate that has a little less butter on it is going to go into the freezer for 30 minutes. And you'll just want to have your butter cubed up just like I have it on these plates. I'm going to make this pie crust in a food processor, but you can also do this by hand. Our flour mixture has been in the freezer for 30 minutes, and I'm going to go ahead now and just put it into the bowl of my food processor, and I'm just using the standard blade. So just go ahead and dump that right in. And if you're doing this by hand, just into a good-sized bowl to give you some room to work with. Set this bag aside because we are going to use it again. Now we're just going to pulse this for a few seconds just to make sure that the salt and the baking powder are well mixed in with the flour. That's perfect. Now we're going to take the larger amount of butter cubes, the ones that were in the refrigerator, and we're going to go ahead and add these right into our flour. And now we're going to run this for about 20 seconds or so, just to the point where this looks like a coarse sand. And you'll know that you have it at the right consistency. If you pick up a little of the flour and rub it through your hands, you're going to feel tiny little like bits of grit, so to speak. It's not going to be, it's just going to be like a coarse meal or a coarse sand. It's not going to be like a wet sand, not yet. Now we're going to take the smaller amount of butter, the butter that was in the freezer, the butter cubes that was in the freezer, and we're just going to add that to our flour. And we're going to pulse very quickly. It may need, oh gosh, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 or so pulses to the point where the frozen butter has broken up into the flour in the size of little peas. So let's start. We'll be careful about it. We don't want it to become completely pulverized and grainy the way we did with the refrigerated butter. We want this frozen butter to be a little more visible. That took about 6 pulses, and you'll see that if you scoop out a little bit of the flour, the butter, the frozen butter, is going to be in the size of small peas. That's exactly what you're looking for. Now we're going to go ahead and add in some ice water to help this become something that's more malleable that we can turn into a pie crust. But we have to be very careful about how much liquid we add because spelt flour, along with the other ancient wheats, absorbs water differently, just like it absorbs fat differently. Now, if we were using modern day all-purpose flour, we may be looking at, for this single crust, needing anywhere from 2.5 to maybe 3.5 teaspoons of ice water. But what we're going to do is start very slowly with this, and we're just going to go ahead and put 1½ teaspoons of ice water. We can always add more water later. We'll see how it looks when we start to pulse it. But before we do that, we want to add a little bit of apple cider vinegar. And it can be raw apple cider vinegar, it can be your homemade apple scrap cider vinegar, store-bought apple cider vinegar, whatever you have. But I really like to use apple cider vinegar as opposed to other types of vinegar. I feel that any little bit of flavor that it may impart into the crust is pleasant. And we're only going to add a teaspoon of this. The reason we're adding vinegar here is because vinegar helps inhibit gluten development. And by inhibiting the gluten development, it helps ensure we have a flaky pie crust. And it also helps that if you're new to baking or new to working with pie crust dough and you overwork the dough, the vinegar can often save the day. And even though you've overworked your dough and maybe the butter has softened and so on and so forth, the vinegar can kind of help rescue it a little and still make you wind up with a flaky pie crust. Now, the gluten in Spelt is a little different than the gluten in modern day all-purpose flour, but all gluten can be slowed down a bit, inhibited a bit by vinegar. And really any type of flour you're using when you're making a pie crust, a little vinegar can always help. Now we're going to pulse this, again, maybe about 6 times. Now I've just pulsed this 3 times. I want to stop. And I'm going to squeeze this flour together and see if it holds together. And it does. It holds together beautifully. And then if we touch it, it'll just crumble right down. Now we're going to put our dough mixture back into our plastic bag. Now all we need to do is basically knead this with our hands to get everything to stay together in a disc, in the shape of a disc. And just do the best you can. It doesn't need to be perfect. It's kind of nice doing it in the bag like this because it's a little easier to not have it sticking everywhere on your counter and on your hands. And it's going to turn out just fine when we take it out of the bag. Now we're going to take our little bag of pie dough and we're going to stick it in the refrigerator for 45 minutes. Then we'll roll it out and I'll show you how to fit it into your pie plate. While the pie dough is chilling in the refrigerator, I just want to take a minute to talk to you about the differences between a par-baked pie crust and a blind-baked pie crust. A par-baked pie crust is a partially baked pie crust, and you generally use this type of pie crust when you need to partially bake the pie crust before filling it with some contents that then needs to be baked in the oven. But the contents that you're filling into that par-baked pie crust, that partially baked pie crust, will bake faster than the pie crust would have baked if it was raw. So by partially baking that pie crust, you get it on its way, you put your filling in, and then you put the whole thing back into the oven. The pie crust finishes baking, and then the contents that you've put into your pie crust will be baked to the perfect level it's supposed to be baked. A blind baked pie crust means that you're going to fully bake your pie crust. And that type of pie crust is generally used with a filling that doesn't require being baked. That you're going to put the filling into the fully baked pie crust and then maybe refrigerate it or get ready to serve it, whatever the case may be. But you've got your fully baked pie crust and then you put your filling right into it and nothing needs to go back into the oven. Once you roll out your pie dough and you put it into your pie dish and you get ready to par-bake or blind bake, you generally will put some parchment paper down into the pie plate on top of the pie dough. And then you'll weight down that parchment paper with pie weights, or some people like myself will just use dry beans. Now, a note about using dry beans. If you do use dry beans to weight down your parchment paper, you always want to use those dry beans as your pie weights. You don't want to try and go and use them to cook later. And then depending on what your recipe may call for, you may at some point have to lift out that parchment paper along with your pie weights and allow the pie crust to bake a little longer. And that's where the pie crust is baking without any parchment paper and no pie weights. It's usually at a point, especially with blind baking, where you need to allow the crust to fully cook and become nice and golden brown. But the initial step with par baking or blind baking, where you put the parchment paper on top of the pie dough and then the pie weights, keeps the pie dough from puffing up. So I hope this little explanation is helpful to you whenever you look at a recipe when you're making a pie that may call for par baking or blind baking. Now I just took my dough out of the fridge, and what I'm going to do is get a little flour and just flour up my board here very lightly. I'm actually putting this on, it's like a silpat, you know, the silicone mats. I love this one because it's nice and big, and it has the circumference, if I'm correct? Yeah, this diameter across and circumference around. But for all different pie sizes. And so, but I'm just going to rub this a little with flour, and then I want to talk about different pie plates in a second. So I've got my dough. I'm just going to put that on the flour. You could use a floured board or a silpat. Like, I find even if I am using a silpat like this, I still like to put some flour down. Then I'm going to put a little flour on top of my dough, just, not crazy, just gently. And then I'm going to put a little plastic wrap on top of that. Now I'm going to let that just rest, just till it gets a little softer. Some people say 5 minutes, some people say 10 minutes. It really depends what temperature it is in your kitchen. Oh, and I just want to mention about this silpat. I've had this one a long time, but if I can find this or something similar, I'll be sure to put a link in the description below. Now this pie dough can fit various size pie dishes. What I have here is a deep dish pie dish, and the interior measures 9.5, but if we go and measure the outside rims as well, it's closer to 10.5. But this one single pie dough to make a pie crust will fit this dish. If you have a smaller dish, it'll fit that too. If it's not a deep dish, it'll fit that too. The only difference you're going to find is that when you put your pie dough that you've rolled out into your pie plate, you'll have a little more overhang if it's a smaller circumference. However, regardless of the size of the pie plate, the pie dish, we're going to roll our dough into approximately a 12-inch circle. Now, as I showed you, I did put a little flour on there, and then I put a little plastic on top. You can certainly just put some flour on your pie dough and roll, and then flour your rolling pin and roll it out that way. If you have one of those cloths that go over a rolling pin, those work beautifully too. And if you don't have a cutting board that you floured or a silpat that you floured, actually what really works the best is just a floured towel. So if you have a dish towel, flour that lightly, put another dish towel on top of it that you floured lightly, and then roll out your dough. It works like a charm. Now I'm just going to start rolling this out. I'm just going to start in the center, and I'm just going to keep working back and forth and rotating my cutting board, rotating my rolling pin to go in different directions till I get to about a 12-inch circle. So I've got this at about a 12-inch circle or so, and now we'll get ready to fold this up and we'll put it into our pie plate. Now I'm just going to fold this in half and then in half again carefully. And now we'll go ahead and put this right down into our pie plate. Folding it like this makes it easy to more or less center it. Once I get the pie dough fitted into the pie plate, I just go around with my fingers. I don't do anything fancy, and I have very short nails, so it's easy to do. But if you have longer nails, sometimes using a knuckle and the outer part or the inner part of your finger can work well. I just go around with my hands like this together, two fingers, and I just crimp a little. I like to keep it looking very rustic. It's spelt. You know, we're not trying to do something very fancy. The fact that I am using ancient grains, I like to make the pies look rustic. So that's all I do. And basically I just roll under any extra I have and, along the rim, and then use my fingers, as I said, to go around and pinch it in. The reason in this particular pie dish I don't put it over this rim is I just find in my oven with this particular pie plate, this can brown up way too fast before the actual pie is ready. So I find in this deep dish, just rolling it under and then crimping it to give it this appearance works better. However, if you do like to pull it over and then do your little indent, you can even use a fork, and you can go around with the tines of a fork, doing any kind of decoration you want. If you have one of those pie edge coverers, today they come in, I have an old one, it's just aluminum and it just fits your standard pie pan. But now they make them expandable, and since this is a little larger, if you have this particular pie dish and you have one of those expandable pie edge protectors, you can certainly extend your dough out, and then when you do the par bake or the blind bake, you may need to use that pie edge protector. Now into the refrigerator for an hour before we bake it. The good news is if you want to do this in advance, a full 24 hours in advance, it works like a charm. You can put this in your refrigerator and 24 hours later, you can use it to make a pie. But today, we'll go ahead and put this in the fridge for an hour, and then we'll blind bake it so you can see exactly how it bakes up. I just took my pie crust out of the refrigerator. It was in there for about an hour. Now I'm going to go ahead and take this piece of parchment paper and just kind of gently do my best, sorry for all the crumpling, and I'm going to tuck it down into the pie, or into the pie crust. Now I'm going to use my pie weights, otherwise known as chickpeas or garbanzo beans, whatever you may know them as. They're the ones I use because I always have a lot of those. So I have dedicated some to being pie weights. And I like them for pie weights because they're round, so they're kind of like actual metal pie weights if you've ever seen those. So I've got that nicely weighted down. You need a good amount, and that's why it's kind of nice to use beans, because the metal pie weights, they can be a little expensive. Okay, I think that's looking good. Now I'm going to put this in my preheated oven, which I preheated to 425 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're going to let this bake for about 15 to 20 minutes. Then we'll take it out and we'll lift the pie weights out and we'll put it back in to fully bake it. So the first bake is going to be the par bake. And if you were just par baking your shell, your pie shell, you wouldn't put it back in. But I'm going to put it back in so you can see what a blind bake looks like too. But you're going to put your parchment paper in, you're going to put your pie weights in, and now into the oven for about 15 or 20 minutes. I'm just going to keep an eye on it. I like a glass pie plate because you can see if it's just, with a par bake, you just want to kind of get a nice little bit of a golden glow to it. And you can always pull these parchment paper back and take a little peek. But that's really what you're looking for. It looks just sort of blonde, just beige, not the golden brown that we associate with a cooked pie. A question that I often get, and so I want to answer it here, is what shelf in the oven should you be baking your pie? Whether it's a par bake, a blind bake, or a filled pie with a top crust as well. no matter what type of pie you're baking, the first couple of times is going to be an experiment. I have a very small oven, so my pie does fine on the middle rack. If you have a very large oven, putting it on the lower rack may be helpful to get that bottom crust nicely cooked. Also, if you find after a couple of tries, no matter where you put your pie in your oven, whether on the middle rack or the lower rack, I've never put it on the top rack, but maybe that's an option, and you find that your crust just seems to come soggy. The sides and the rim are light and crispy, but that darn bottom just isn't baking up nice. Maybe it's soaking up some of the moisture from whatever you've put in the pie, whatever the case may be. A solution to that may be getting a baking stone and putting your pie dish on the baking stone, which can really help regulate the temperature and get that bottom crust cooked nicely. Another option is, which we'll talk about when we do the blind bake, is that sometimes what you can do with a blind bake is when it's basically finished, take it out and paint it with a little bit of egg white, like an egg wash made from egg whites. Put it back into the oven just for like 30 seconds, a minute, just to let that egg wash dry up. Then put your filling in. Now that is for a blind bake where you're not putting it back in the oven. If you're doing a par bake and it's just a single crust like this, you can do the same. You can take your pie weights out, give it a little egg wash, put it back in, bring it back out. You know, let the egg wash basically just cook up for 30 seconds or whatever, just to dry, and then bring out your par bake, put your filling in your pie, put it back in the oven, and that may help as well. But if you are doing a regular double crust, like making an apple pie or whatever the case may be, that baking stone may be a good option for you. Well, I left this in the oven for 20 minutes, and now I'm going to lift out this as carefully as I can. I lift out the pie weights, and I'm just going to put these over in this bowl because we're going to want to let them cool completely before we put them away. And now you can get a feel for what a blind, not a blind bake, but a par bake looks like. Now we're going to put this back into the oven, same temperature, and we're going to let this bake until it takes on more of a golden brown color. And that'll be our blind bake. But if you are using this now as a par bake, you want to let it cool completely, then put in your filling, and then put it back into the oven to finish baking. Well, this was in the oven for another 10 minutes, and it's a beautiful golden brown. Once this cools, it'll be all ready for a delicious filling. However, I'm going to use this as our test crust, actually, because I want to cut into it so I can show you how flaky it is. So I'm going to bring you in for a close-up so you can see how flaky and light this is. It's absolutely glorious. Look at this. Oh my gosh, this is so beautiful. This is just so flaky, and I hope you can really see it in the close-up pictures. And the bottom is just so, I don't know if you can hear that. It's really well baked. It's not the least bit mushy, and what's nice is it's not greasy. I think you're going to be so thrilled to be able to bake with Spelt, and then coming up I'm going to show you how to do einkorn in a future video. But I think you're going to be so happy to finally have a crust using ancient grains, ancient wheats, that's not greasy. Well, let's give this a taste and see how it is. It's so flaky. It's tasty, it's flaky, not the least bit greasy. You're gonna love this Spelt pie crust. Now, if you want more pie crust, including a no-roll pie crust, perfect for Thanksgiving, and any time of year for that matter, be sure to click on this video over here, where I have a full playlist of pie crusts and more. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.